Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Tzadi begins with the Gemara's attempt to resolve a problem on a brisa it has just quoted. And this is on the subject of whether a carbon is your own personal money or it belongs to Shemayim, it belongs to Hektish. Once you're Makdish, you consecrate it to be a carbon. Does that make it not yours anymore, or is it still considered yours, even though you have to bring it? So, in our brisa, which we quoted recently, we saw halacha which the Gemara found surprising. The halacha over there said that if you sell a carbon Pesach, and that means that you take money from somebody to include him in your carbon, so the money that he gives you is chulin. On the other hand, if you sell other kabbanos like a shlamim, the sale is not valid and the money is kachim. So the Gemara is confused. How is it that if you take money from somebody to include him in a carbon Pesach, how does the money become chulin? The money that he set aside to buy a share of the carbon, he was makdish. So it was hektish before he gave it to you. The carbon was hektish. So how do you swap hektish for hektish and end up with chulin? Doesn't make sense. So the Gemara answers that by saying that there's an opinion, at least one, possibly more, that hold that a carbon Pesach is actually chulin. When you're makdish the animal, you leave some part of the animal over that still belongs to you. It may be in your possession, you may have to bring it as a carbon, but it's still considered yours. It's your money, and you can do what you want with it. You can even sell it and use the money for something else, and that's what our brisa is holding over here. It's holding that the carbon is chulin. Now, there are two ways to approach this. It could be that the carbon is always chulin, and therefore it belongs to you, and you have a right to sell it, and the money that you take for it goes to chulin. Or it could be that the money that you set aside to buy a carbon Pesach is chulin. That would also answer the question, because that would mean that when this fellow in the brisa took money for his carbon, the money that he took was chulin money. It was never hektish. Even if the carbon was hektish, when he took the money stayed chulin, because what happened? The guy gave him the money as a gift, and he gave him the carbon Pesach as a gift. Either way works. The Gemara is going to try to figure out which way is the correct way, but either approach works, either to say that a carbon Pesach is always yours, or to say that the money you set aside to buy a carbon Pesach is always yours, and therefore this money that you've received for your carbon is yours. Again, either it could be because you're receiving it as a gift, or because you're receiving in exchange for the carbon itself, which is chulin. The Gemara is going to get into this now, and we have three opinions of Tanaim here about karbanos. First of all, there's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Aglili that holds that all kachim kalim, which includes a shlamim, carbon Pesach includes all of these belong to the owner. They're not considered to be hektish money. They have hektish kedusha, but they're not hektish money. They're considered to be your own money. You could sell it. Rabbi Yossi Aglili is definitely not the author of our brisa, because the second half of the brisa said that a shlamim that you sell, the money is hektish. So it's not Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So it's got to be somebody else. Now, on the opposite extreme, you have Rebbe. You have the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan hold that it's completely hektish, and you cannot use it for anything except for Pesach needs. The case is where somebody has his carbon Pesach, he's a makdish, and he realizes he doesn't have enough money to buy his other needs for Pesach. So he wants to sell part of his carbon, he wants to sign somebody else up for it and take money in exchange, and then use that money for his own needs. So the Chachamim, the Rabbanan, say he can only use it for Pesach eating needs. He can only use it to buy wood to roast it, or buy things like that. That's considered part of the Pesach needs. He could use it because it's hektish money. Rebbe says, and Rebbe is the middle opinion who we're going to focus on the most, Rebbe says he could use it for any needs he wants. The money says, because when he signs somebody up for a carbon, the money that he gets is his. That could be understood one of two ways. It could be understood, like we said earlier, that the money that you set aside for a carbon Pesach is always chulin, and therefore the money that the person who's signing up gives to the owner is given to him on condition that it stays chulin, and it will stay chulin, therefore he could use it to buy whatever he wants. Or you could learn an even more radical thing, which is that the animal itself belongs to the owner and that it is chulin. Now, which is the correct way? So says Abaye, I would have said it the less radical way. I would have said that the money is chulin, but the carbon is hektish. However, Reb Oishia says it the more radical way. He says that even the carbon itself is chulin, and the money that you're exchanging for it is chulin. It's not that the carbon's chulin, I should say. The carbon belongs to the owner. It definitely has kedusha, but it's still considered the possession and the property of the owner. Where is this discussion of Rav Oishia? So it's talking about the case of somebody who wants to give his carbon, he wants to sign up to his carbon a zoina. The halacha is that you are not allowed to you are not allowed to buy karbanos with two types of money that's considered tainted. That's money that's used to pay off a zona, to pay a prostitute, and money that's used to buy a dog. Both of these are considered to be unsavory money. You can't use it to buy karbanos. If you do, it's puzzle. Now, what if you use this money? What if you use karbanos, things which are already hektish, you use it to buy a dog or to pay off a zaina? Does it make a psul when you already have a carbon and animals are already hektish, it's already mukdash? Does the psul apply to that or not? Does it get a psul by being used then, after the hektish is already on it, to pay off a zaina or to buy a dog? So you would have thought on your own, of course not. How could it be? It doesn't belong to the owner. The owner is just the one who's bringing the carbon. He doesn't own it. He can't use it to pay off anything, and therefore there is no sale. There is no payment. So of course it doesn't get a psul. The Gemara, however, says that it's not so simple. The Gemara quotes a brisa, and the brisa says that you would have learned out that there is a psul if you use a carbon already to pay off a zaina. You would have learned it out from a balmum and a bird. You would have said as follows: the halacha is that a bird can never become a balmum. However, karbanos that are already hektish could become a balmum. Therefore, a bird is more resilient to psulim than a carbon is. Now, does the psul of esnan zaina and mechir kelev, do these two things apply to a bird? Yes, they do. The pasuk says you cannot use lachol neder, an extra lachol, or Rabbos Ovo said even birds have this psul. So Gemara wants to say then, so now I should have a kal v'chomer. I should say, if the psul of becoming zona money or dog money applies to a bird, which can't become a balmum, it should certainly apply to a carbon, which could become a balmum even once it's already hektish. Says the Gemara, I have to have a pasuk to defeat this kal v'chomer. I have a special drasha. The Torah says l'chol neder, that is to exclude something which is already nadur. When you're actually using an animal to fulfill a vow, that's when you have a problem. You cannot use zaina money or dog money. But it's something which is already nadur, it's already hektish, zaina money and dog money is not a psul on it. So the Gemara brings a pasuk to tell you that there is no psul of zona money and dog money that applies to an animal which is already hektish. Says the Gemara, that doesn't make sense. Why should I need a pasuk? Why don't I just say, like we said earlier, it's logical that there's no problem because it doesn't belong to the owner. It's just his rights to bring it, but it's not his money, and therefore he can't. It doesn't become zona money if he uses it to pay somebody off because he's not actually paying anybody off. It's not his. So Gemara says that this brisa here is obviously written by somebody who holds that karbanos do belong to the owner. Now, there's two ways of going with this. We could say that it's Rabbi Yossi Aglili. If we say it's Rabbi Yossi Aglili, then the following thing happens. I don't have to say it's Rebbe. If it's not Rebbe, then I could say that Rebbe holds that a Korban Pesach does not belong to the owner. He just says that the money you set aside stays chulin and that belongs to the owner. And then that would be the lighter explanation we mentioned earlier. That would be why, that's how we would understand why Rebbe would say that in our case, the money stays chulin. However, Rabbi Oshia says differently. Rabbi Oshia says this brisa is Rebbe. He doesn't want to say that it's basically. He says it's Rebbe. That being the case, it's got to be that the animal itself belongs to the owner. The animal itself has a certain aspect of chulin in it, and not just the money. Once that's the case, says Abaye, okay, I could still answer my question. As a matter of fact, it's a better answer to the question. Now I understand, in even more extreme, the animal itself of a Korban Pesach becomes chulin. Again, Rebbe only says it by a Korban Pesach. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says it by all karbanos. So if you're going to say that it's Rebbe, we have to say that this case with the zona was talking about a Korban Pesach. But that is what Rabbi Yossi likes to do, and that's what that's what his explanation of this brisa is. Rabbi Yossi was many generations before Abaye, and he was a close talmid of Rebbe, and therefore Abaye isn't going to accept Rabbi Yossi's explanation. This is the pshat that it's Rebbe, and Rebbe therefore holds that it is. It belongs to the owner. A Korban Pesach belongs to the owner, and therefore, as far as explaining our original brisa, the explanation will be that it's a carbon, that a carbon Pesach originally belongs to the owner, according to Rebbe. Rebbe is the author of the Brisa, and that's why there's no problem with the fact that the money is chulin. Asks the Gemara, what do you mean Abaye would have said that the explanation of the Brisa about the Esnan Zona is that it's basically Aglili, but Rebbe holds that people reserve as chulin the money of their karbanos and not the karbanos Pesach themselves. We have a clear recording of where the explanation that uses that Rebbe says is that people reserve the carbon as chulin. He says so specifically. Sumer says, okay, so Abaye will say that that's not what he meant exactly. When he said the carbon, he either meant, or you have to change the version, where it's that it's the money of the carbon. The reason why there's a sense of chulin about the carbon is because the money that's used to buy the carbon is left in reserve. Okay, now the Gemara goes a bit deeper into the machlokes between Rebbe and the Rabbanan concerning whether you're allowed to use the money from that you earn from including somebody else in your carbon. What are you allowed to use that for? So the Gemara has a machlokes between Rabba and Reb Zera, what Rebbe and the Rabbanan are arguing about. So they all agree that as far as buying wood to roast the carbon, nobody argues you're definitely allowed to use that. That's part of the carbon's avoda. You certainly, that's not extra money. That's not your own needs. That's the carbon needs. They argue as to whether or not there's a machlokes about using the money to buy matzah and maror. According to one, that's considered to be carbon needs because you need to have the matzah and the maror to be able to fulfill the mitzvah. According to the other, no, that's not part of the carbon. That's a separate thing. That is an argument between the Amoraim, whether it's an argument between the Tanaim or not. The place that they argue for sure is about your own personal needs like clothing and things like that are not part of the carbon at all. That is where there's a machlokes for sure. And the machlokes bases around how you translate the pasuk that says in Yamat Habayis Meyos Miseh, if you don't have enough money, if you have a yamat, you have too little, what could you use? So it's Meyos Miseh. You could live off the lamb, meaning you can sell part of the lamb and use the money. According to one, it's Hechayehu L'seh, it's don't live off the lamb, it's keep the lamb alive and don't spend the money on you. According to the other, it's Mehiyos Miseh, you can live off the lamb and you could use that funds to buy your own stuff. We now begin the next Mishnah, which begins the halachos of a zav and a zav as far as the carbon Pesach is concerned. This Mishnah holds that if Erev Pesach falls on the last day of Tumah, you're allowed to include the zav or zava in the carbon, because by the time nightfall arrives, they'll already be tar and they'll be able to eat it. And therefore, even though at the time of Shechita they're tamei, they can still be included. Now, there's a number of different ways in which the last day of Tumah or a zav could fall on Erev Pesach. First of all, a zav. If he saw a flow of ziva twice, the halach is he has to count 7 clean days, and at the end of the 7th day he's tahar, goes to the mikvah. He doesn't have to bring a carbon, and therefore he's fine. So for him, if the 7th day falls on Erev Pesach, he's okay. However, if he saw 3 times a flow, then he has to bring a carbon on his 8th day, and he can only be included in the carbon Pesach if his 8th day falls on Erev Pesach, because it's not till after the carbon, or at least the opportunity to bring the carbon, that he becomes tahar at night. Now, what about a zava? So if she sees once or twice, then she has to keep 1 clean day. If that day is Erev Pesach, she's okay. If, however, she sees 3 times, she has to wait 7 clean days and bring a carbon. But if her 8th day then falls on Erev Pesach, then she's okay, because she will have brought the carbon on the 8th day, and she'll be qualified to eat from the carbon Pesach that evening. Okay, the Gemara now begins, and it introduces a machlokes. The Mishnah had discussed somebody who has to bring a carbon, and he will not be ready to eat the carbon Pesach until his carbon to be mitahar him is brought. He's allowed to be part of the carbon Pesach even before the carbon is brought. The Gemara says the same applies to somebody who went to the mikvah and he doesn't become tahar until the sun comes down. He's what's called a tvul yom. He's allowed to be included in the carbon Pesach because when the sun comes down that night he'll be able to eat it. Says the Gemara, there's a machlokes between Rav and Ula. What's halacha about somebody who has tumas sheretz and he didn't go to the mikvah yet? He has to go. It's a 1 day tuma if he goes to the mikvah and the sun comes down. So what is he has to do? He has to go to the mikvah and then the sun comes down and then he's tahar tonight. So he should also be able to eat from the carbon just like everybody else in the Mishnah. But the Gemara says that's what Ula says. Ula holds that's halacha. Rav disagrees and Rav says no, he cannot be included in the carbon even though he'll be tahar tonight. So the Gemara asks why is it different than everybody in the Mishnah? So the Gemara says because the people in the Mishnah they will become tahar automatically when the sun comes down. The tahar is automatic. This guy has to go to the mikvah. He hasn't been yet. So Gemara says, well, what about the person who has to bring a carbon? He hasn't brought the carbon yet. How do you know that he will bring that? So the Gemara says we're referring to a situation where he has the carbon in his hand and he's ready to go. So Gemara says the carbon in his hand and he's ready to go. So the Tumas Sheretz guy could also, if he has a mikveh in front of him and he's ready to jump in. Gemara says, no, maybe he'll be negligent and he won't go. Gemara says, well, then maybe the guy with the carbon will be negligent and he won't bring it. Gemara says, no, it's referring to a case where he already put money in the box. The way things worked was that the people have to bring a carbon for kapara. There was a big box. They didn't have to actually bring birds. They just put the money, the fixed amount, the cost of the bird in the box. Kohanim came, and there was a bezdin of Kohanim. They were responsible to take the money out of the box, buy karbanos, and bring them that day. And the person could just go home and he could assume his carbon was brought. So once he put the money in the box, even though his carbon wasn't brought yet, still, he could assume that it's going to be brought in. He could be included in the carbon Pesach because the carbon Pesach will be taken care of. It's out of his hands. As far as the one who's just waiting for the sun to go down, it's also out of his hands. However, the guy who has to go to the mikvah because of Tumas Sheretz, it is not out of his hands yet, and therefore he cannot be included in the carbon Pesach till after he goes to the mikvah. The Gemara says if this is the case, we're afraid that he's not going to go. That sounds like it's the psul d'Rabbanan. That means that is the Rabban who said that really you should be able to be included in the carbon because he's going to be tar at night. However, we're afraid he won't go, so we rabbinically ban him. The Gemara says that's problematic because Rav said elsewhere that in a situation where you have the klal 50% exactly are tar, 50% are tamei, and therefore we can't bring a carbon b'tumah, what you do is you take a sheretz and you're matama somebody, and that way you have one more tamei person, and now you're roiv tamei, and we know that you could bring a carbon pesach if the majority of the people are tamei. But if Rav says that the problem with sheretz is only d'Rabbanan, so then how does it help? Midaraisa, then you wouldn't be allowed to bring a carbon Pesach at all, because Midaraisa it's still 50-50 tahar, and 50-50 tamei. So what does it help? So says the Gemara, no, so Rav really holds that it's puzzle d'Oraisa. It's not because we're afraid he's going to bring it. Rav holds that at night, that even if you're going to be tahar at night, you cannot be included in the carbon. And he learns it out of the following thing. The pasuk describing the people who had to bring a Pesach Sheni because they were tamei says like this: Ish kiyeh tamei lenefesh. Somebody who has tumas meis. Now tumas meis on the 7th day is the last day. The tumah comes off that night. So why can't he be included? The pasuk doesn't differentiate between which day of tumah it is. So obviously the fact that he's becoming tar at night doesn't help you, and that's where Rav derives his halacha from, and it's really a psul midaraisa. Where it says, but how does Rav know that that's referring to even the guy on the 7th day? Maybe it's only referring to the first 6 days. So where it says it's simple, he learns like Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak said that this was referring to a specific scenario where people were tamei meis, and it was the 7th day, and he learns it out of the pasuk that says, when the people came to Moshe Rabbeinu to complain and say, why can't we bring a carbon? They said, they couldn't bring the Pesach on that day. Says Rabbi Yitzchak, that day they couldn't bring it, but the next day they could. And yet still they weren't allowed to bring it, and that day obviously was the 7th day of their Tumah, and you see the fact that you're going to be Tamei at night does not help. Okay, now the Gemara attempts to bring a proof again against Rav from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had said 2 examples of a zav on the 7th day and a zav on the 8th day. Now a zav on the 7th day has to go to the mikvah. If he goes to the mikvah, it becomes tahar by nightfall. A zav on the 8th day has to bring a carbon on his zavos. If he brings the carbon, then he becomes tahar also at nightfall. Says the Gemara, The Mishnah did not differentiate. The implication would seem to be that the Zav on the 7th day is allowed to be included in the carbon, even if the carbon is being brought at the time he did not go to the mikveh yet. That's true. Then he's just like the one who's Tomas Sheretz and didn't go to the mikveh yet. So why would Rav not allow the case of Tomas Sheretz? The implication of our Mishnah is clearly that even the Zav on the 7th day who didn't go to the mikveh yet is still allowed to be included in the carbon. So Gemara says, no, that's not the pshat. And I'll prove you that's not the pshat. The Mishnah on the 7th, when it refers to the Zav on the 7th day, is referring to after he went to the mikveh. When all he needs is nightfall, and I'll prove it to you. Because if it's talking about whereas before he went to the mikvah, and he still has to go to the mikvah and wait for the sun to set before he could be tahar, what's added by telling me that on the 8th day, where he has to bring a carbon and wait for sundown, he's allowed to join? Of course he is. If he's allowed to join on the 7th day, where he needs to go to the mikvah and wait for the sun, he's allowed to join on the 8th day, where he needs to bring a carbon and wait for the sun. What's added? It must be that what's added is that when we said on the 7th day, we were referring to that he went to the mikveh already. And the chiddush is that even though he went to the mikveh already, the sun did not set yet, he's still allowed to be included in the carbon because the sun sets by itself and it's not up to him. And then we add another chiddush. The chiddush is that even when he didn't bring the carbon and some action has not been done yet, it's not just the sun that sets automatically. Somebody has to do an action here. He's still allowed to join because the Kohanim are going to do it, and you could assume that they are going to do it automatically. That would be a chiddush. But according to you, that the case of the Zav on the 7th day was referring to where he didn't go to the mikveh yet, and he's allowed to be included in the carbon Pesach, even though he still has to go. What's a chiddush of the 8th day where he didn't bring the carbon yet? So Gemara says, no, I'll tell you what the chiddush is. Your eye is not a eye. The chiddush on the 8th day is that on the 8th day it's not dependent on him. Going to the mikveh, he could just go himself. On the 8th day, the Kohanim have to bring it. It's not up to him. So therefore, maybe I would say that he can't be included. And that the Mishnah says, no, even on the 8th day where it's up to the Kohanim, you could assume that the Kohanim are going to do it correctly and he's allowed to go. Okay, the Gemara now refers to the Zava. The Zava she can go to the mikvah on the 7th day and she has to bring a carbon on the 8th day. So the Gemara says that there was a version of the Mishnah that said that she can be included even if her 7th day is Erev Pesach. The Gemara asks, how could she do that? How is she different than the Zava has to wait for the 8th day? So the Gemara changes and says, no, it's only on the 8th day. The Gemara says 8th days. That it's already Pashut, that's the same as the Zav. So the Gemara says, no, the Chiddush again is that it's dependent on Kohanim, and you may think that Kohanim aren't going to bring it, and the Kamashman is that they are, or you could even say that the Chiddush is that there's a Maisa that has to be done. Says the Gemara, another explanation is offered by Ravina. Ravina says we're not really talking about a Zava here, we're talking about a Nida. A Nida is a woman who bleeds. By her, the halacha is she has to wait 7 days of Tumah. She doesn't have to wait 7 clean days. After the end of the 7 days of Tumah, at night, she can go to the mikveh then. So Gemara says, how could she be included? She can't go to the mikveh until night, and she doesn't actually become a tahar until the 8th day. Till the end of the 8th day, when the sun sets on the 8th day. How could you include her if her tefillah was on the 7th day, and Erev Pesach fell on the 7th day? Her tefillah is not until the night following the 7th day. She can't be included. So Gemara says, no, it's referring to when her 8th day fell on Erev Pesach. Therefore, she went the night before to the mikvah, and she becomes tahar when the sun sets on the 8th day, which is Erev Pesach, and therefore she's okay. The Gemara says, well, then what's the chiddush of that? That's just like anybody who is just waiting for the sun to set. That's the regular tefillah yom. Gemara says the chiddush is to emphasize that she has to wait for the 8th day. If it be the 7th day, it's no good, because it's a rare halacha that somebody has to wait until nightfall to go to the mikvah. Usually we say mikvah sayam kekulo, and she can go in the morning. However, on the nida and on the yoledis, we don't say that. She has to wait until the night after the 7th day to go. That is a Zera B'Rabbanan, but that's the chiddush of this.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.